My name is Thea Rivers. I'm 32 years old. I'm a captain in the United States Marine Corps. And on my own wedding day, my mother slapped me so hard in front of 200 guests that my lips split against my own teeth. The entire chapel fell silent. Every guest froze in their seat. Warm blood ran from my lip, dripping onto my white wedding dress. My jaw rang like a steel bell struck with full force. My mother, wearing a gray coat, stood right in front of me. A coat she hadn't even been invited to wear. She was breathing heavily. Both of her hands were still raised. And in her eyes, I didn't see anger. I saw fear. At that moment, my husband, Major Daniel Brooks, stepped between us. He was a Marine Corps pilot, the kind of man who had landed aircraft safely through the worst storms without ever raising his voice. And today, he didn't raise it either. He looked at my mother and calmly said, "You've just assaulted an active-duty military officer. Please turn around and face the wall." His voice was as calm as someone reading a routine checklist. But those few words changed my mother's life forever. Everyone inside the chapel believed the story had started with that slap. But the truth was far more dangerous. The slap wasn't the crime. It was only a cover for the real crime. And that plan hadn't begun that day. It had started 8 years earlier. My own sister had spent 8 years carefully weaving a trap around me without me ever realizing it. Later, we discovered something shocking. My mother could never have walked onto that military base by herself. Someone had signed her in. Someone had authorized her access. And that person was a member of my own family. But we're not there yet. First, you need to know who was standing beneath that wedding veil. People always assumed I had been lucky. The truth was, luck had very little to do with my life. When I was 16, I worked 2 jobs. Every morning, I bagged groceries at a supermarket in Roanoke, Virginia. Every evening, I cleared tables at a small family restaurant. My dream was to save enough money for college, but my savings never grew beyond a few $1,000s. When I turned 18, I stopped waiting for luck. I walked straight into a Marine Corps recruiting office. In 2011, I enlisted. I started my career as a supply clerk. My job was managing equipment, records, and paperwork. That's where I learned something I've never forgotten. Paper never lies. People do. Paper simply preserves their lies. I worked all day and studied online every night, 1 class at a time. I earned my college degree. Then, in 2019, I received my commission as an officer. In the Marines, people like me are called Mustangs, enlisted Marines, who earn their way to becoming officers. By the age of 32, I was Captain Thea Rivers. As a logistics officer, my responsibility was making sure 400 Marines had the food, fuel, and supplies they needed, exactly when they needed them. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest work, and it carried the responsibility of hundreds of lives. I met Daniel Brooks at a military airfield in North Carolina. The cargo manifest for his aircraft didn't match my paperwork. The mistake was his. I showed him the evidence. Without hesitation, he smiled and said, "You're right." That was the moment I knew any man willing to admit he was wrong was a man worth keeping. A few years later, we got engaged. We rented a small apartment just outside Marine Corps Base Quantico, only 10 minutes from the front gate. Daniel flew missions. I planned logistics. Every Sunday morning, we made pancakes together and promised each other that for one day, we wouldn't talk about the military. It was the first truly peaceful home I'd ever known. But there was one question everyone at the wedding kept asking. Why hadn't I invited my mother? Every guest had already made up their own story. Some believed I was a stubborn daughter. Others assumed my mother had simply been difficult. And many people as usual, had already passed judgment without knowing the truth. But the truth was far darker than anything they could imagine, because my mother hadn't come to my wedding just to ruin it. She had arrived as the final piece of someone else's plan, and I still had no idea that my own sister had spent the last 8 years carefully preparing to destroy my entire life. Inside the chapel, the silence still lingered. Blood continued to drip from my split lip. A nurse, who happened to be one of the guests, hurried toward me. She gently pressed a handkerchief against my mouth, but my eyes never left my mother. The slap itself didn't surprise me, because it wasn't the first time she had hurt me. The only difference was that today, the whole world had witnessed it. A few moments later, 2 military police officers rushed into the chapel. They approached my mother respectfully, but with unmistakable authority. "Ma'am, please come with us." My mother glared at me. Then she shouted, "She's my daughter. No one can tell me what to do." One of the officers answered calmly, "This is a military installation. Everyone here is subject to the law." My mother tried to pull away, but within seconds, she was escorted out of the chapel. The guests looked from one another, completely stunned. No one understood what had just happened. I took a slow, steady breath. Daniel quietly reached over and took my hand. He knew that for me, this wasn't just a slap. It was every old wound being torn open again. The chaplain stepped closer and asked gently, "Captain Rivers, would you like to continue the ceremony?" I stood there for a few silent moments. Then I touched my injured lip, smiled, and said, "Today is the happiest day of my life. I'm not going to let anyone take it away from me." Applause filled the chapel. A short time later, we were married. But in truth, the real story was only beginning. The following morning, Daniel and I reported to the military police office. They explained that every person who entered the base left a complete digital record. Identification, time of entry, who authorized the visit. Everything was stored in the system. The officer opened the database. He typed for several moments. Then, his expression changed. He stared at the screen, looked again, then turned toward us. "Captain Rivers, something about this doesn't make sense." My heart started pounding. "What is it?" I asked. He turned the monitor toward us. There it was. My mother's name, entry time, 9:12 a.m. But the most important detail was the line directly beneath it. Sponsor, authorized by. I read the name, and for a moment, it felt like all the air had left my body. It wasn't Daniel's name. It wasn't mine. It was my younger sister's, Amy Rivers. I froze in my chair. Only one word escaped my lips. Amy, how is that possible? She wasn't in the military. She wasn't supposed to have access to the base. The officer noticed our reaction. He opened additional records. Then he said, "This isn't an isolated visit. Your sister has entered this base multiple times over the past several months, using different visitor authorizations." I stared at him. "For several months?" He nodded. "Yes. And every single visit was sponsored by an active duty service member." Hundreds of questions raced through my mind. Why had Amy been coming onto the base? Who had she been meeting? And most importantly, why had she arranged for our mother to be there on my wedding day? Daniel spoke immediately. "Can we see who sponsored those visits?" The officer opened another file. A list of names appeared on the screen. Most of them meant nothing to me. But then, I saw the final entry. Every hair on my body stood on end, because that name belonged to someone who worked in my own logistics unit. Someone who stood in front of me every day. Someone who saluted me every morning. And never once had I imagined that he was secretly working with my own family against me. That was the moment I finally understood. This wasn't A family dispute. It was a carefully planned operation, one that had been meticulously built over the course of 8 years. But I still didn't know what my sister had been trying so desperately to hide from me. The next morning, I went straight to my office. There was only one question running through my mind. Amy, what had she been doing against me for the past 8 years? The moment I sat down at my desk, I requested access to every official record connected to the case. Since the incident involved security on a military installation, the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, NCIS, had already joined the investigation. By noon, 2 investigators arrived in my office. One of them was Special Agent Mark Henderson. He placed a thick case file on my desk. Then he looked at me and said, "Captain Rivers, we believe this case is far more serious than you realize." I didn't say a word. He opened the file. The first document was dated 2018. I frowned. That was before I became an officer. Agent Henderson nodded. Exactly. And that's why no one suspected anything. I turned the next page. There was my name, but the signature wasn't mine. My breath caught. These signatures are forged. The agent nodded immediately. Yes. Our forensic laboratory has already confirmed it. I looked up at him. But why? Why would someone forge my signature? Without answering, he slid another document across the table. It was an official request submitted under my name, asking for access to sensitive military supply records. If that request had been approved, someone could have used my identity to commit serious crimes without me ever knowing. My heart began pounding. I asked quietly, "Who submitted it?" Instead of answering, the agent placed a photograph in front of me. In the picture, my sister, Amy, was standing beside the same logistics employee whose name we had found in yesterday's access records. Both of them were smiling. The photograph was 7 years old. I leaned back in my chair. Everything was beginning to make sense. Amy hadn't met that employee by chance. They had known each other for years. Agent Henderson opened another folder. Inside were copies of emails. Most of the messages had been deleted, but the digital forensic team had managed to recover a large number of them. As I read one particular message, my hands began to shake. It said, "If we're going to destroy Thea, we have to make everyone believe she can't be trusted." At the bottom, there was only a single letter. A. Amy had always signed her private messages with just that one letter. I didn't need any more proof. But one question still remained. Why? I looked at Agent Henderson. Why would she do this? He remained silent for a few moments. Then he finally said, "We don't believe you've seen the real motive yet. This wasn't just harassment. It was preparation for something much bigger. Maybe financial gain. Maybe revenge. Or maybe the complete destruction of your military career." At that exact moment, my phone rang. It was my bank. The representative said, "Captain Rivers, we'd like to verify some unusual activity on your account." My stomach tightened. What kind of activity? The voice replied, "This morning, someone attempted to obtain information about one of your joint accounts." I sat upright. Who? There was a brief pause. Then the representative answered. She identified herself as your sister, Amy Rivers. The phone almost slipped from my hand. This wasn't just about the military base anymore. Amy was still trying to use my name and my identity. And for the first time, I understood something. The slap on my wedding day had never been the real objective. It was only meant to create a distraction. While everyone was focused on the chaos, someone else was carrying out the real plan. But what was that plan? A few hours later, We were about to find the answer on a bank security camera. The following morning, Daniel, Special Agent Mark Henderson, and I went straight to the bank. The branch manager was already waiting for us. She led us into a private conference room. She closed the door, then quietly said, "Captain Rivers, if we hadn't seen this video ourselves, I'm not sure we would have believed it." She turned on the monitor. The security footage began to play. The timestamp read 11:13 a.m., the exact same time my wedding ceremony was taking place. On the screen, my sister, Amy, walked into the bank. She confidently placed her driver's license on the counter. Then, she handed the teller a thick file. The bank employee carefully examined the documents. A few moments later, he nodded, but then his expression changed. He immediately reached for the phone. Seconds later, the branch manager appeared. The video stopped there. The manager looked at us. That was the moment we knew something wasn't right. She slid a document across the table. The moment I saw it, my heart nearly stopped. It was a power of attorney, a legal document that would have given someone the authority to control my financial affairs. But the signature wasn't mine. It had been forged. I looked at the manager. "Those are my signatures." She nodded. "We thought the same thing. That's why we stopped the transaction." I frowned. What was she trying to do? The manager answered. "She requested access to all of your joint investment accounts and information about your safe deposit box." I stared at her. "But I don't have any joint investment accounts." Special Agent Henderson opened another file. Then he said quietly, "Actually, you do. You just never knew they existed." I looked at him, completely stunned. He removed an old financial record. The date was 2018, the same year your forged signatures first appeared. An investment fund had been opened in my name. Every month, money had been deposited into that account. The individual deposits weren't especially large, but over 8 years, the balance had grown into a substantial amount. I looked at Henderson, who was making the deposits. Instead of answering, he handed me another document. Depositing entity. There was only one name, Rivers Family Holdings LLC. I frowned. Our family has never owned a company by that name. Henderson nodded. Exactly. Because it never really existed. It was a paper company. And according to the registration documents, you were listed as one of its owners. I stared at him. Without me. Without my signature? Without my permission? He answered firmly. Yes. And based on the evidence, your sister, Amy, created the company with the help of an outside financial consultant. The room fell completely silent. Now, one thing was perfectly clear. My mother's outburst inside the chapel hadn't been spontaneous. She had deliberately drawn everyone's attention to herself so that, while the chaos unfolded, Amy could use forged documents to gain access to my financial records. But one careful bank employee had stopped the scheme before it succeeded. I took a slow breath, then quietly said, "Now, I'm going to confront my sister." Agent Henderson immediately shook his head. "No, Captain. This is no longer a family matter. We're investigating forgery, identity theft, and possible financial fraud. We gather the evidence first. Then, we make our move." At that moment, his phone vibrated. He read the message. For the first time, I saw genuine surprise on his face. "What is it?" I asked. He looked up and said quietly, "We found your sister's laptop, and inside it, there's a folder called Operation Wedding." My breath caught. If that folder contained what we believed it did, then after 8 long years, the entire conspiracy was finally about to tell its own story. The next morning, Daniel, Special Agent Mark Henderson, and I arrived at the investigative office. In the center of the table sat a black laptop. It belonged to my sister, Amy. The digital forensics team had spent the entire night breaking into it. Agent Henderson took a deep breath. Then he turned the screen toward me. There was only one folder displayed on the desktop. Operation Wedding. My hands began to shake. The agent opened the folder. Inside were dozens of subfolders. Each one was labeled with a date. The oldest was from 2018. The newest had been created just 2 days before my wedding. I stared at the screen. She actually kept 8 years of records. The agent nodded slowly. Maybe she never believed anyone would ever find them. He opened the first folder. Its title read, Mom's Roll. My heart started racing. Inside was a detailed timeline. It explained exactly what my mother was supposed to say, when she should enter the chapel, and the precise moment she was supposed to slap me. For several seconds, I forgot how to breathe. Everything had been planned. My mother hadn't acted in a fit of anger. She had been following someone else's script. I whispered, no, she couldn't have done this. Agent Henderson opened another folder. Inside were dozens of messages between Amy and my mother. One message from Amy read, the moment everyone looks at Mom, I only need 5 minutes. Another message from my mother replied, don't worry, everyone's attention will be on me. My hands turned cold. The chaos inside the chapel had been staged from the very beginning. Daniel sat beside me. Without saying a word, he simply held my hand tighter. The agent opened another folder. Its name was Future Assets. Inside were copies of my bank records, my salary information, my investment portfolio, and every detail of my insurance policies. Only someone with access to internal military records could have gathered that information. I looked at Henderson. How did she get all of this? Without speaking, he placed a photograph on the table. It showed the same logistics employee we already suspected. Amy was sitting beside him, inside a small cafe. The two of them were studying something on a laptop. The photograph had been taken 3 weeks before my wedding. Henderson pointed at it. This man was pulling information from your system, and Amy was using it. Tears filled my eyes. For years, I had trusted the people I worked beside, and one of them had quietly sold out my life. Just then, the forensics specialist walked into the room. He was holding a printed email. He looked at Henderson. Sir, I think this may be our strongest piece of evidence. Henderson took the paper. He read it. Then he went completely silent. What does it say? I asked. Without speaking, he handed me the email. There was only one sentence. Once the wedding is over, Thea will have nothing left. Beneath it were 3 names. The first, Amy Rivers. The second, the logistics employee. Then I saw the third name. My breathing stopped. It belonged to someone in my own family. I had never once suspected. Richard Rivers, my uncle. Suddenly, everything came rushing back. For years, he had been the one constantly turning my mother against me. But never, not even once, had I imagined he was part of the conspiracy itself. Agent Henderson looked at me. Captain Rivers, we now have enough evidence to begin building a criminal case. But if we're going after Richard, we need his financial records. At that moment, another investigator hurried into the room. His face was unusually serious. He looked directly at Henderson, then said, Sir, we've traced Richard Rivers' offshore bank accounts. The room fell completely silent. Now, it was undeniable. This wasn't just a family betrayal. Behind it was a sophisticated financial fraud worth millions of dollars and a conspiracy whose final chapter would be written in a courtroom. The following morning, the investigative team began tracing every financial record linked to my uncle, Richard Rivers. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a family dispute. It was a carefully organized financial fraud that had been running for years. Richard had placed nothing in his own name. Every property, every investment, every bank account was hidden behind layers of shell companies. But money always tells the truth. The forensic accountants reconstructed every transfer. They followed the money, transaction by transaction. And in the end, every trail led back to just two companies. The ultimate beneficiaries were Richard and Amy. I sat quietly, turning page after page. Only one question kept repeating inside my mind. Why? What did I have that was worth 8 years of lies, deception, and betrayal? Just then, Agent Henderson walked over, holding an old file. He placed it in front of me. Captain Rivers, I think the answer is in here. I opened the file. It belonged to my late father. My hands froze. I was only 12 years old when my father was killed in an accident. After that, my mother handled every financial matter in our family. I never questioned any of it. Inside the file was a registered will, but it wasn't the version I had been shown as a child. This was the original. I began reading. My father had divided all of his personal investments into 2 equal shares, one half for my mother, the other half for me. Amy's name didn't appear anywhere. I looked up in disbelief. How is that possible? Agent Henderson answered quietly. Because Amy was born after this will was written, and your father passed away before he had the chance to update it. A chill ran through my body. Was this the real reason? Had Richard seen the will years ago? Was that why he had spent so many years building a case against me? The agent turned another page. There was a handwritten note. It was from my father. It read, "If my daughter Thea ever reads this, tell her I have always been proud of her, and I know she will never compromise her integrity." Tears filled my eyes. For years, I had believed my father had left me nothing, but the truth was exactly the opposite. At that moment, the office door opened. One of the investigators hurried inside. "Sir, Richard Rivers, through his attorney, has denied every allegation." Henderson looked up, and the investigator replied, "He claims he has evidence proving that Captain Rivers planned everything herself." For a moment, I couldn't speak. "He's trying to blame me?" I asked. Henderson gave a faint smile. "Yes. And that's the biggest mistake he could have made." I looked at him, confused. He placed another folder on the table. Across the front were 2 words, "Digital evidence." "Richard doesn't know." Henderson said that we already have copies of his email servers, his phone records, and his cloud backups. The evidence he believes will clear his name is actually the evidence that will convict him. At that moment, the forensic specialist turned his laptop toward us. On the screen was a single video file. Its title was Final Meeting.mp4. The date was the night before my wedding. If that video contained what we believed it did, then after 8 long years, the conspiracy was finally approaching its end. The following morning, an unusual silence filled the conference room at the investigative office. A laptop sat in the center of the table. On its screen, there was only one file, final meeting.MP4. The video had been recorded the night before my wedding. Before pressing play, Special Agent Mark Henderson looked around the room. Then he said quietly, "If this video contains what we believe it does, everything about this case is about to change." He clicked the play button. The screen faded to life. A private office came into view. Sitting behind the desk was Richard Rivers. Across from him sat my sister, Amy. A few moments later, my mother walked into the room. My heart started pounding. It was the first time I had ever seen the three of them together. Richard placed a file folder on the desk. Then he smiled and said, "Tomorrow, it all ends." Amy looked at him. "And what if Thea makes a scene?" Richard laughed. "She won't. I know her. She'll stay quiet. She always chooses to protect her dignity instead of making a spectacle." My hands slowly clenched into fists. They had spent years mistaking my silence for weakness. Richard turned toward my mother. "You'll do exactly what we planned. You'll walk into the chapel, slap her in front of everyone, and shout that she's a terrible daughter. After that, everyone will be watching you. And Amy will have 5 minutes." Was the exact same phrase we had recovered from the emails. Now, we weren't just reading it. We were watching it happen. The video continued. Amy smiled. "5 minutes is all I need. I'll get to the bank and submit the power of attorney." Richard nodded. "The money will be ours, and the blame will fall on Thea." Every investigator in the room fell silent. This wasn't merely a plan, it was a recorded confession. But the next few seconds were even more shocking. My mother looked at Richard and quietly asked, "What if the police arrest me?" Richard answered, without hesitation, "Don't worry. You'll just look like an angry mother. At worst, they'll question you for a few hours. The real job will already be done by Amy." I closed my eyes. So my mother had known from the very beginning exactly what she was doing. This wasn't a moment of anger. It was a carefully rehearsed conspiracy. The video was almost over when Richard said something else, something that changed the entire investigation. He laughed and said, "Besides, if Plan A fails, we already have Plan B." Amy looked curious. "And what's that?" Richard reached beneath the desk and pulled out a brown file folder. Across the front was written, "Captain Thea Rivers." He rested his hand on top of the folder, then smiled. "There's enough material in here to get her thrown out of the Marine Corps if we ever need to." My breathing stopped. I had never seen that file before. What was inside? Forged documents? False accusations? Or something even worse? Agent Henderson paused the video. He looked at me. "Captain Rivers, we now have proof of the conspiracy and a recorded confession. But there's still one thing we have to find." I looked at him. "What?" He answered, "The brown file. Because if we recover it, we'll finally know how many false records they've spent the last 8 years creating against you." At that exact moment, the conference room door burst open. One of the investigators rushed inside. He was carrying a sealed evidence bag. Trying to catch his breath, he said, "Sir, during the search of Richard Rivers' office, we found the brown file." A chill ran through my entire body. At last, every lie they had spent 8 years building against me was about to be exposed, one page at a time. The following morning, only a handful of people were inside the evidence room at the investigative center. Special Agent Mark Henderson, two forensic specialists, Daniel
and I.
In the middle of the table sat the same brown file Richard had mentioned in the video. Across the front, in bold black letters, were the words, Captain Thea Rivers. Henderson broke the evidence seal. The room fell completely silent. He removed the first document. I looked at it, and my breath caught. It was a copy of my official service record, but several pages had been altered. One report claimed I had violated military procurement regulations. Another stated that I had issued improper orders to a subordinate Marine. I immediately said, every bit of this is false. Henderson nodded. We know. Every document in this file is a forgery. One of the forensic specialists began examining each page, one by one. A few minutes later, he looked up. Every forged document uses the exact formatting of official military records. But the ink and the print characteristics all trace back to the same private printer. The printer was recovered from Richard Rivers' office. I let out a slow breath. There was no room for doubt anymore. Then Henderson opened the second section of the file. Across the cover were the words, Reputation Plan. Inside was a detailed strategy for destroying my reputation, which relatives should be contacted, what lies should be told to former coworkers, what rumors should be spread, and, if anyone still believed in me, what new accusation should be invented next. My hands began to shake. Suddenly, memories from years ago came flooding back. Friends who had suddenly cut off all contact. Relatives who quietly drifted away. The senior officer who had once asked me in a strangely cautious voice, were you really investigated for financial misconduct? At the time, I had no idea where those rumors had come from. Today, I finally had the answer. For 8 years, someone had been systematically destroying my reputation. Daniel quietly took my hand. He looked at me and softly said, you were never the problem. The problem was always the people who were afraid of you. For the first time in years, I stopped blaming myself. At that moment, Henderson opened the final envelope.
The side
Was only a single USB drive. Written across it, in black marker, was one word, insurance. I looked at him. What is it? He plugged the drive into the computer. A few seconds later, dozens of folders appeared on the screen. Audio recordings, emails, bank records, private videos. But one file stood out. At the very top. If something goes wrong. Henderson pressed play. Richard appeared, alone, facing the camera. He looked directly into the lens and said, if you're watching this, it means our plan has failed. The room fell silent. Then Richard continued, if we're arrested, put all the blame on Amy's mother. My breathing
stopped.
He had already planned to sacrifice his own sister, my mother, instead of protecting her. The video ended. Henderson closed the laptop. Then he looked at me. Captain Rivers, we now have proof of forgery, proof of financial fraud, proof of identity theft, and now a full recorded confession to the conspiracy. But one question still remains. I looked at him. What question? He answered. Where did Richard get all of his money? According to his tax records, his reported income was relatively small, but his spending amounted to millions of dollars. At that exact moment, the evidence room door opened. A financial investigator walked inside. He carried a newly printed report. He placed it on the table, then said, "Sir, we've traced an offshore trust, and Richard isn't the primary beneficiary." I looked at him. "Then who is?" The investigator turned toward me, then quietly answered, "Your mother." It felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath me. All this time, I had believed my mother had simply been manipulated by the people around her.
But now,
For the very first time, I had to consider something far more terrifying. Maybe she hadn't been just another victim. Maybe she had been one of the key players in the conspiracy all along. The next day, my mother sat inside a secure interview room at the investigative center. Across the table were Special Agent Mark Henderson, two federal prosecutors, and me. It was the first time in 8 years that the two of us had sat together without saying a word. She didn't look like the woman I remembered. The anger
was gone.
in its place were exhaustion, regret, and perhaps, for the first time, fear. Henderson laid every piece of evidence on the table: the forged signatures, the bank records, the surveillance videos, the emails, and the offshore trust. In a calm voice, he said, "Ma'am, we now have answers to almost every question. Only one remains. Would you rather tell the truth here, or wait to tell it in court?" The room remained silent for several long moments. Then, for the first time, my mother looked directly at me. There were tears in her eyes. She spoke softly. "Thea, I lied to you for years." My heart began pounding. She continued, "Your father loved you more than anything, and I always resented that." I didn't interrupt. I only listened. She lowered her head. "When your father died, Richard came to me. He said, 'If Thea inherits everything, there will be nothing left for Amy.'" I was weak. I believed him. A tear rolled down my cheek. But she wasn't finished. Henderson asked, "And the offshore trust?" My mother closed her eyes.
It
Was opened in my name, but I never spent a single dollar from it. I looked up.
what?
She nodded slowly. "Richard told me it's only for legal protection. When the time comes, we'll divide everything fairly." I believed him. Henderson immediately placed another document in front of her. But according to these records, millions of dollars were transferred out of that trust during the last 5 years. She stared at the report. The color drained from her face. "No, I didn't do this. I didn't even know it happened," Henderson answered quietly. "We know because every transfer was authorized using your digital signature. But our forensic analysis shows Richard created those signatures himself." Silence filled the room. Richard hadn't used only me. He had manipulated his own sister as well. My mother covered her face with both hands. Then she broke down. "I never trusted my own daughter. And the brother I trusted betrayed me, too. For years, I had imagined this moment. I thought I wanted an apology. I thought I wanted her to admit she had been wrong. But now, watching her fall apart, I didn't feel hatred, only sadness. I quietly said, "Mom, nothing can undo what happened. But please, don't hide the truth anymore." She nodded. "I'll tell the court everything, the whole truth." At that moment, the interview room door opened. A federal prosecutor walked inside. He carried 3 arrest warrants. He looked at Henderson. The judge has signed the warrants for Richard Rivers, Amy Rivers, and their accomplice.
Daniel looked at me.
Then quietly said, "This isn't the end. It's the beginning of justice." I turned toward the window. The sun was rising. For 8 years, I had carried the weight of other people's lies. But today, for the very first time, I understood that the truth always finds its way into the light. But one final surprise was still waiting, because when Amy was taken into custody, she looked straight at the investigators and said, "I didn't do this alone. The person who created the whole plan is still free." The room fell silent. Once again, Amy's arrest took place at 8:15 a.m. Federal agents placed her in handcuffs and brought her to the investigative center. She no longer looked as confident as she once had, but there was still a strange determination in her eyes, as if she still believed the game wasn't over.
Inside
the interrogation room, Special Agent Mark Henderson sat across from her. Daniel
and I
stood behind the observation glass. The recording
began.
Henderson opened the first case file, then calmly said, "Amy Rivers, you are facing evidence of forgery, identity theft, financial fraud, and criminal conspiracy." Amy said nothing. Henderson placed the meeting video on the table, the one showing Richard, my mother, and Amy planning everything the night before my wedding. When the video ended, Amy took a long breath. Then, for the first time, she lowered her head. "I know. There's no point in denying it anymore." Henderson asked, "Then tell us why." For the first time, her voice began to crack. "I always lived in Thea's shadow. Everyone praised her. Everywhere I went, I was introduced as Thea's sister. I remained silent. I knew jealousy could blind people, but I had never imagined it could turn son into a criminal." Henderson asked his next question. "Who came up with the plan?" Amy didn't answer right away. She picked up her glass of water, took one sip, then quietly said, "Richard didn't create it. He only carried it forward." The room fell silent. Henderson leaned forward. "Who created it?" Amy closed her eyes. Several seconds passed. Then she whispered a single name, "Victor Hayes." I froze. I had never heard that name before. Henderson's expression changed instantly. He sat up straight. "You know Victor Hayes?" Amy nodded. "He was Richard's business partner. And he taught us how to destroy someone's life without ever touching them." My heart started racing. Henderson immediately pulled out a photograph. "Is this him?" Amy looked at the picture, then quietly answered, "Yes, that's him." Henderson took a slow breath. And through the observation glass, he looked directly at me. I immediately understood. He recognized the name. After the interview, we met inside his office. I asked the first question, "Who is Victor Hayes?" Henderson remained silent for several moments. Then he answered, "He's more than a businessman. He has been investigated multiple times for financial fraud, shell companies, identity theft, and corporate scams. But every time, he pushes other people to the front, and he walks away untouched." I looked at him. "So, you think he's the real mastermind?" Henderson nodded slowly. "That's exactly what we believe. At that moment, the office door opened. Another investigator hurried inside. He was carrying a fresh report. Sir, we searched Victor Hayes' office, but he wasn't there. Henderson looked up. When did he leave? The investigator answered. About 2 hours ago. And he took every computer and every phone with him. Silence filled the room. He had run, but in his hurry, he had made one mistake. Inside a hidden safe in his office, investigators found a passport. It wasn't issued under his real name. It carried a completely false identity. Inside the passport was an airline ticket for an international flight departing the following morning. Henderson immediately picked up
His phone.
He spoke only one sentence. Notify airport security. Victor Hayes is going to try to leave the country. I looked out the window. For the first time, I realized our fight was no longer only against my own family. The real architect of the conspiracy was now running from the law, and we were only a few steps behind him. The following morning, security at Washington International Airport was unlike anything I had ever seen. Federal agents, airport police, investigators. Every entrance was covered. Special Agent Mark Henderson stood near the security checkpoint, holding a photograph of Victor Hayes. Updates arrived through his radio every few seconds. Daniel and I stood several yards away. Henderson had already warned us. You stay back. This is a law enforcement operation now. A few minutes later, a voice crackled over the radio. Target spotted. Every eye turned toward the immigration checkpoint. A man wearing a baseball cap and dark sunglasses walked quickly through the terminal. In his hand was a passport issued under a false identity. His face matched the photograph perfectly. It was Victor Hayes. The moment he reached the immigration counter, 4 federal agents quietly surrounded him. One of them said, Mr. Victor Hayes, you are under arrest for financial fraud, forgery, criminal conspiracy, and identity theft. Victor tried to run. He made it only 2 steps. The agents tackled him and placed him in handcuffs. As they secured him, he looked directly at me. Then, with a faint smile, he said, You won. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. I answered with only one sentence. No, I didn't win. The truth did. 6 months later, the federal court delivered its verdict. Richard Rivers, Amy Rivers, and Victor Hayes, all 3, were found guilty of financial fraud, forgery, identity theft, and criminal conspiracy. Every illegal asset was seized. Every shell company
Was dissolved.
The secret offshore trust was permanently terminated by court order. My mother stood before the judge. She admitted everything she had done because she had cooperated with investigators from beginning to end and provided critical evidence. The court considered her assistance when determining her sentence. After the trial, she walked
Toward me.
There were tears in her eyes, the same tears I had seen only once before, many years ago. She quietly said, Thea, if you never forgive me, I'll understand. I won't blame you. I stood silently for a few moments. Then I answered, Forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting. But I don't want to spend the rest of my life carrying hatred. We didn't hug each other. Some distances can only be shortened by time. 1 year later, I was still serving in the United States Marine Corps. Daniel was still making pancakes every Sunday morning, and one tradition had never changed. On Sundays, we never talked about the Marines, the courtroom, or the case. We talked about life. Sometimes, I still look at our wedding photographs, the white dress, the chapel, and that moment when blood ran down my lip. Once, that picture filled me with pain. Today, it reminds me that real strength isn't found in raising your voice. It's found in standing by the truth. If I had answered that slap with anger, I probably would have become just another person lost in the chaos. Instead, I chose patience, and that patience exposed an 8-year conspiracy to the world. If you've listened to this story all the way to the end, perhaps you've also known someone who treated you unfairly. Remember this: lies may survive for years, but their foundation is always fragile. The truth may arrive late, but sooner or later, it always finds its way out. If you enjoyed this story and you'd like to hear more heartfelt family dramas, stories of betrayal, revenge, and justice, then be sure to subscribe to our channel, give this video a like, and turn on the notification bell so you'll never miss our next story. We'd also love to hear your thoughts. Tell us in the comments below, if you were in Thea's place, would you have forgiven your mother? Your comment means a lot to us and helps our community grow stronger. Thank you for watching until the very end. We'll see you soon with another powerful, emotional, and unforgettable story.